The small town felt quaint and pleasant back when I was just a young child starting school. I attended a local kindergarten that seemed perfectly normal, filled with toys and crude art on the walls. However, there was one strange girl named Annabelle who refused to join the rest of the class. She spent every single hour sitting in her designated corner making little figures out of colorful Play-Doh. After finishing a figure, she would smash it with her little fist or slowly pull off its limbs. The teachers eventually began to ignore her as she wasn't causing any immediate harm to anyone else. I decided it was my duty to be nice to her, assuming she simply had a condition that made her different. To my shock, she greeted me with a massive, friendly smile and invited me to sit down. She immediately began teaching me how to craft the figurines and the specific ways to crush them. She insisted that certain figures needed big ears or large noses to represent specific people we knew. When I finally asked why we were doing this, she whispered a single word: Voodoo. She explained that these were effigies of our classmates and that our actions would transfer to them. I asked why she wanted to hurt them, and she simply rolled her eyes and called me a dummy. I later learned that Annabelle's family were outcasts in town and she had been bullied by the other kids. One day, the teacher announced that a popular girl named Kirsty had fallen gravely ill with leukemia. My young mind immediately made the connection to the voodoo dolls we had been crushing. I felt as though we had effectively sentenced a classmate to death with our playtime. Then, a teacher I disliked broke her leg in the yard shortly after we smashed a larger doll. The guilt became an internalized trauma that I carried with me every single day. Eventually, I broke down and confessed everything to our head teacher during recess. Instead of comforting me, the teacher screamed at me for being a disrespectful and horrible child. I felt totally awful and ran to my only friend, Annabelle, to vent my frustrations. I realized too late that I had just admitted to ratting her out as well. Annabelle sat in silence for a long time, as if she were thinking very hard about something. I suggested that maybe we should just make a voodoo doll of the teacher to get back at her. Annabelle shook her head and said she had a better idea to prove my loyalty. She pulled a huge kitchen knife out of her bag and told me I needed to stab the teacher. She wanted me to do it 16 times to satisfy both her and the voodoo gods. In that moment, I realized Annabelle was a bloodthirsty psychopath despite her age. I refused her demand, telling her there was no way I would ever do something so horrible. Annabelle suddenly pulled a pair of small sewing scissors out and stabbed me in the leg. Blood started gushing from my thigh as I began to scream at the top of my lungs. Annabelle didn't stop there. She lunged at me again with the large kitchen knife. Thankfully, the teacher heard the commotion and managed to tackle her from behind. I was rushed to the hospital and never saw Annabelle again after that day. My parents told me later that she was sent to an institution for serious therapy. We moved to a different state immediately to escape the trauma of the event. I am now in college, but the memory of that potential killer still haunts me. I try to tell the story as if I were a hero just to stay sane when I think about it. I refuse to dwell on what could have happened and instead focus on the fact that I survived. The survival I spoke of felt like a temporary reprieve as the following Monday arrived with a heavy silence in our kindergarten classroom. Tommy's chair remained empty at the small wooden table we shared. Our teacher, Mrs. Gable, announced with a tremor in her voice that Tommy had been rushed to the hospital over the weekend with a sudden, unexplained fever. I felt a cold prickle on the back of my neck and instinctively turned to look at Annabelle. She was already staring at me with a wide, toothy grin that didn't reach her glazed eyes. During recess, she beckoned me into the shadows behind the plastic playhouse at the edge of the yard. She whispered that the Play-Doh doll she smashed on Friday was exactly where Tommy's stomach hurt now. My heart hammered against my ribs as I remembered the violent way she had flattened the blue clay figure. Annabelle told me that the dolls were just the beginning of our work. She invited me to her house after school, claiming her mother was out and we had something important to finish. Against my better judgment, I found myself walking toward her dilapidated Victorian-style home as the sky turned a bruised purple. The front door creaked open before I could even knock, revealing a hallway that smelled of stale cigarettes and damp earth. Annabelle led me straight to the kitchen where a single bulb flickered overhead like a dying star. On the laminate counter sat a massive pile of gray, unidentifiable clay mixed with strands of what looked like human hair. "This is for Mrs. Gable," she said, her voice dropping to a low, guttural rasp. I watched as she began to shape the mass into a crude, elongated human form with a disproportionately large head. She reached into a kitchen drawer and pulled out a long, serrated bread knife that caught the flickering light. I stepped back, my heels clicking against the linoleum as the situation shifted from weird to deadly. She told me I had to be the one to cut the doll's throat to make the magic real. I shook my head, refusing to touch the weapon or participate in her sick fantasy. Annabelle's face contorted, her features twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She lunged across the counter, the knife swinging in a wide arc that narrowly missed my chest. I tripped over a discarded kitchen chair, crashing hard onto the cold floor. She was on top of me in an instant, her small knees pinning my shoulders to the linoleum. The serrated edge of the blade pressed against the skin of my neck, cold and biting. She hissed that if I wouldn't kill the doll, I would have to be the sacrifice instead. I grabbed her wrists, using every ounce of my 5-year-old strength to keep the blade from sinking in. We grunted and thrashed, our small bodies a whirlwind of desperate motion in the cramped kitchen. In the heat of the struggle, I managed to plant a foot in her stomach and shove her backward with all my might. She hit the base cabinets with a sickening thud, and the knife clattered across the floor toward the stove. I didn't wait for her to recover, scrambling to my feet and sprinting for the front door. I could hear her screaming behind me, a high-pitched, inhuman sound that echoed through the empty house. I burst out into the cool evening air, my lungs burning as I ran all the way to my own house. When I reached my porch, I collapsed against the door, sobbing until my mother found me. I told them everything, but to my horror, the adults dismissed it as a childhood game of make-believe that got too rough. The next day at school, Annabelle was gone, her desk cleared out as if she had never existed. Mrs. Gable never returned either, and the rumor was that she had suffered a stroke that very same night. I thought the nightmare was over when we moved away a few months later to escape the memories. But years later, I found a small, dried Play-Doh doll in the pocket of my old winter coat. It had a single strand of my own hair wrapped tightly around its neck, and as I touched it, I heard a familiar, toothy giggle from the hallway. The memory of Annabelle's giggle eventually faded into the background of my childhood, but the void she left was soon filled by someone far more persistent. Her name was Bethany, and our parents had been best friends since before we were born. This meant our friendship wasn't a choice, but a lifelong sentence served in playrooms and shared backyards. Even as a toddler, Bethany exhibited what we jokingly called goblin mode, though the reality was far less endearing. She would often crawl into small, dark spaces and hiss at anyone who tried to coax her out. As we entered middle school, her eccentricities morphed into a sharp, jagged edge of social isolation. She didn't just lack social skills, she seemed to actively loathe the happiness of others. My other friends tried to warn me that her energy was toxic, but my mother insisted I keep her close. Whenever I spent time with someone else, Bethany would find out and the goblin would emerge with a vengeance. She had a way of looking at you that made you feel like you were a piece of property she had misplaced. One afternoon, I invited a classmate named Sarah over to work on a biology project. We hadn't told Bethany, but within 20 minutes the doorbell began to ring incessantly. When I opened the door, Bethany was standing there with dirt smeared across her forehead and leaves in her hair. She didn't say hello. She simply pushed past me and walked straight to where Sarah was sitting. "You're in my spot," she whispered with a voice that sounded like grinding stones. Sarah left within 5 minutes, visibly shaken by the raw hostility radiating from the floor. I turned to Bethany to demand an explanation, but she was already busy tearing the pages out of Sarah's notebook. Her jealousy wasn't about love or friendship, it was about total and absolute control. This cycle continued for years as she systematically drove away anyone who tried to get close to me. She would start rumors, steal personal items, and sometimes just stand outside people's houses until they felt unsafe. By the time we were 16, I was the only person left in her friendship circle, a circle that felt more like a noose. Our parents saw us as inseparable, unaware of the psychological warfare happening behind closed doors. One weekend, my parents announced we would be hosting a joint sleepover at our house. Bethany arrived with a small, locked wooden box that she refused to let out of her sight. The evening was filled with her usual goblin antics, like eating unpopped popcorn kernels and staring at the ceiling for an hour. But as the clock struck midnight, the atmosphere in the room shifted into something primal. She began to chant something under her breath, a rhythmic humming that made my skin crawl. I told her to stop and go to sleep, but she just hummed louder, her body starting to twitch. Suddenly she stopped humming and turned her head toward me with a speed that felt inhuman. "You think you can ever leave me?" she asked, her voice sounding like it was coming from the floorboards. I tried to get up, but I found that my sleeping bag had been tied shut from the outside while I wasn't looking. She crawled toward me on all fours, her movements jerky and spider-like. She reached into her wooden box and pulled out a long, rusted pair of garden shears. My breath hitched as she placed the cold metal against my throat. "If I can't have your friendship, I'll have your silence," she whispered, her eyes dilated to full black. I thrashed against the nylon fabric, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Just as she began to squeeze the handles, a loud thud came from the upstairs hallway. Bethany froze, her head snapping toward the sound with that same terrifying speed. The light in the hallway flickered on, and the sound of my father's footsteps echoed on the wood. In an instant, Bethany dropped the shears and curled into a ball, pretending to be fast asleep. As my father walked into the room to check on us, I looked down and saw the rusted shears weren't on the floor anymore. She had hidden them inside my sleeping bag, right against my leg. I lay perfectly still as my father's silhouette lingered in the doorway, unaware of the cold metal resting against my skin. The rusted shears felt like an icicle pressing through the fabric of my pajamas, threatening to bite into my thigh with any slight movement. Across the room, Bethany watched me from her own pile of blankets, her eyes gleaming with a predatory focus that made my blood run cold. My father finally closed the door, leaving us in a suffocating darkness that seemed to vibrate with Bethany's erratic breathing. I heard the rustle of fabric as she began to crawl toward me, her movements jerky and animalistic on the carpet. She leaned over my face, her breath smelling of sour milk and the copper tang of the shears she had hidden. She whispered that the shears were a gift and that if I told anyone, she would make sure I never used my legs again. I tried to scream, but the air felt like lead in my lungs as she reached into my sleeping bag to reclaim the weapon. Her fingers brushed my skin, feeling more like cold talons than the hands of a 10-year-old girl. Suddenly she began to growl, a low and guttural sound that didn't seem humanly possible for a child her size. She started thrashing around the room, knocking over lamps and tearing at the posters on my walls with a sudden, violent energy. In the midst of her frenzy, she stopped and looked at me, a twisted smile spreading across her face as she gripped the shears. Before I could react, she lunged toward her own arm, slicing a long, shallow line into her forearm. Blood began to bead on her skin, and for a moment the room was silent except for the sound of my own frantic heartbeat. She tossed the shears onto my lap and took a deep, shuddering breath, her eyes filling with fake, practiced tears. A blood-curdling scream erupted from her throat, echoing through the quiet house like a siren. My parents burst into the room seconds later, the light from the hallway blinding me as I sat there holding the weapon. Bethany pointed a trembling finger at me, sobbing hysterically about how I had attacked her for no reason. I tried to explain, but the words died in my throat as I looked down and saw my own hands covered in her blood. The look of pure disappointment on my father's face was more painful than anything Bethany could have done with those shears. In an instant, the girl who had spent years making my life a living hell had become the ultimate victim in the eyes of everyone. The police arrived later that night, their flashlights cutting through the domestic safety of our home like knives. I was taken to a separate room for questioning, the sterile atmosphere making me feel like a criminal in my own house. No one believed me when I told them Bethany had brought the shears, especially since they were found in my personal sleeping bag. She had planned it perfectly, right down to the tiny, shallow cuts that looked exactly like defensive wounds. The school social worker was called in, and within days, rumors of my violent tendencies spread like a plague through the neighborhood. Even after the physical wounds healed, the psychological stain of her accusation remained, isolating me from all my peers. But Bethany's victory was short-lived as her parents began to notice her strange behavior wasn't stopping with me. They found her in the middle of the night, rearranging the furniture in their living room to create a weird, altar-like structure. She was humming a song that sounded like a distorted lullaby, her movements rhythmic and trance-like. When her mother tried to intervene, Bethany turned on her with a kitchen knife, her eyes void of any recognition. It was then that they finally realized the problem wasn't me, but the darkness living inside their own daughter. The decision was made quickly to send her to a reform camp, a place designed for children with severe behavioral disturbances. I watched from my window as they led her to the transport van, her hands restrained in small plastic zip ties. She didn't fight or cry, she just stared up at my window and mouthed a single word that I will never forget. It looked like she said soon, as if her departure was merely a temporary setback in a much larger game. With her gone, a heavy weight lifted from the neighborhood, though the scars of her presence remained etched in our memories. My reputation was slowly restored, but I could never quite trust another friend again, always looking for the hidden shears. Years passed, and the story of Bethany became a local legend, a cautionary tale about the girl who wasn't quite right. I thought I had moved on until a letter arrived in the mail today with no return address and a single dried flower inside. As I turned the envelope over, I saw the postmark was from the town where the reform camp used to be, and the ink was still fresh. I dropped the letter from the reform camp as if the paper itself were burning my skin. The ghost of Bethany was a weight I couldn't shake, but life at St. Jude's High moved on without mercy. That was when I first noticed the strange alliance forming between the peak and the valley of our social world. Bradley was the quintessential golden boy, a varsity captain with a future as bright as the sun. Kenny, on the other hand, was the boy who sat in the back of the class, flinching at every loud noise. It started when Bradley stepped in to stop a group of seniors from dumping Kenny's bag into the trash. To everyone else, it looked like a rare act of genuine kindness in a place built on cruelty. Bradley became Kenny's self-appointed guardian, escorting him through the halls like a personal bodyguard. But the way Bradley looked at Kenny wasn't just protective, it was possessive. They began spending every lunch hour together in the library, secluded from the rest of the student body. I saw Bradley leaning in close, his voice a low murmur that never quite reached the ears of passers-by. Kenny's face began to change over the following weeks, losing what little color it had left. He stopped doing his homework and started carrying a heavy, locked briefcase everywhere he went. Rumors began to circulate that Kenny was working on something secret for his new powerful friend. Bradley started cutting off Kenny's contact with teachers, speaking on his behalf whenever questions were asked. One afternoon, I saw them behind the gymnasium where no cameras could track their movements. Bradley was holding a small glass vial, showing it to Kenny with a terrifyingly wide grin. Kenny looked like he wanted to run, but Bradley's hand was clamped firmly on his shoulder. That night I couldn't sleep, thinking about the look of pure terror on that boy's face. The next morning, the school atmosphere felt thick with a tension that threatened to snap. Bradley suddenly sprinted into the principal's office looking frantic and disheveled. He claimed he had found something in Kenny's locker that would change everything. Security guards swarmed the 300 wing, pushing students back with unusual aggression. I watched from a distance as they used bolt cutters to snap the lock on Kenny's locker. Inside, they found a stack of notebooks filled with detailed maps of the school's ventilation system. Tucked behind the books were 3 of the same glass vials I had seen Bradley holding the night before. The principal's face turned white as he read the labels scrawled in what looked like Kenny's handwriting. Kenny was dragged out of his chemistry class in handcuffs, sobbing and pleading his innocence. Bradley stood in the center of the hall, playing the role of the heartbroken friend perfectly. But when he lowered his hands for just a second, I saw it, the faint, satisfied curve of a smirk. He had successfully painted Kenny as a monster in the making, and himself as the tragic hero who stopped him. The news cycle devoured the story of the quiet kid's sinister plot within hours. I knew Kenny was many things, but a mastermind of chemical warfare was not one of them. I decided to follow Bradley after the police left, staying far enough back to remain unseen. He entered an old abandoned shed that sat on the edge of the school property. I crept to a grime-streaked window and peered into the darkness inside. Bradley was sitting at a makeshift table, surrounded by dozens of journals identical to the ones found in Kenny's locker. He was practicing Kenny's signature over and over again on the pages. My foot caught on a stray piece of metal, creating a loud, echoing clang. Bradley stopped writing and turned his head slowly toward the window where I stood. He didn't look surprised. He simply stood up and reached for the door handle, whispering my name into the cold air. Even more damning was the origin of the poison, a rare substance used exclusively by professional extermination firms. He didn't look surprised. He simply stood up and reached for the door handle, whispering my name into the cold air. Neil leaned in close, his breath smelling of stale coffee and something much more bitter. He began to list details about my mother that no stranger should ever have known. Every word felt like a deliberate strike against the armor I had built around my heart. He claimed she left not because of a failing marriage, but because she couldn't stand the sight of me. My silence was the only confirmation he needed to know he had found my breaking point. Neil told me that from this day forward I was his shadow and his shield. I accepted the deal because the alternative, having my family's secrets spilled, was unthinkable. The first task he gave me was to intimidate a freshman who had dared to look at him wrong. Neil watched from the top of the stairs, laughing as I growled threats I didn't mean. Each time I used my size to terrify another, a piece of my self-respect withered away. Neil's demands grew more frequent, moving from simple intimidation to physical violence. He wanted me to be the weapon that he was too physically weak to be himself. Whenever I hesitated, he would simply whisper her name, Clarissa. The weight of my actions began to manifest in my grades and my relationship with my father. My dad would look at me with those tired eyes, wondering where the boy he raised had gone. I lashed out at him because I couldn't face the truth of my own cowardice. Neil began to use me to settle old scores with the popular seniors who used to ignore him. I was forced to scratch the paint of a pristine sports car while Neil filmed from the bushes. Every sound of a distant footstep made my heart hammer against my ribs like a trapped bird. Neil kept the footage as insurance, a digital leash he could yank at any time. Our friendship was a parasitic bond that was slowly draining the life out of me. Everything changed when Neil set his sights on the same girl I had been secretly admiring. He told me he wanted her, and that I was going to help him convince her. For the first time in months, a spark of genuine resistance flickered in my mind. Neil noticed the hesitation, and his smirk transformed into a mask of pure malice. He pulled me into an empty art classroom and slammed the door shut. He began to reveal even darker secrets, things he claimed my mother did for money. He laughed as he described the man she was currently living with, calling him a saint for taking her in. The internal pressure I had been suppressing for years finally reached its limit. I didn't think, I simply moved, my body reacting with a speed I didn't know I possessed. I grabbed Neil by the waist and hoisted him into the air like he was nothing but a rag doll. The look of pure shock on his face was the last thing I saw before I slammed him down. The sound of him hitting the heavy wooden table echoed through the quiet room like a gunshot. I stood over him, my hands shaking as I realized the extent of the damage I had done. I didn't run. I waited for the consequences, knowing that I finally had to face everything. During the investigation, a truth surfaced that made the world tilt on its axis. The man my mother had run away with, Neil Saint, was actually Neil's own biological father. Neil hadn't just been bullying me, he had been conducting a vendetta against his own father's new life. As the police led me away, I saw my father talking to a man who looked exactly like a middle-aged version of Neil, and their expressions were terrifyingly identical. The sight of my father and the man who looked like Neil froze the blood in my veins. I couldn't understand why they were standing together with such terrifying familiarity. The officer pushed my head down as he closed the door of the patrol car. I watched through the glass as my father handed the stranger a thick envelope. Hours later, I sat in a cold interrogation room waiting for a lawyer who never came. Instead of a lawyer, my father walked through the heavy steel door alone. He didn't offer a hug or a word of comfort as he sat across from me. He told me that the charges would be dropped if I agreed to never mention Neil's name again. I asked him who that man was, the one who looked just like the monster that ruined my life. My father sighed and admitted that the man was his own brother, my Uncle Elias. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Neil was actually my cousin. My father explained that Neil's family was the dark side of the lineage they tried to hide. He had used me as a pawn to keep Neil from bringing scandal to his doorstep. All those years of being Neil's punching bag were orchestrated to protect my father's reputation. I realized that I wasn't just a victim of a bully, but of a whole legacy of cruelty. I refused the deal and demanded to speak to the lead investigator immediately. My father's composure broke as he realized he could no longer control me. I told the police everything about the secret payments and Neil's violent history. Outside the station, Neil was waiting for me, leaning against his car with a jagged knife. He lunged at me, screaming that I had betrayed the bloodline. I didn't run this time. I met his charge with a decade of built-up hatred. We tumbled to the ground, a chaotic mess of limbs and muffled grunts. I felt the cold sting of the blade slice across my palm as I fought for control. With a final, desperate heave, I pinned him against the cold brick wall. I looked into his eyes and saw the cowardice hidden behind his bullying facade. The police swarmed out of the building, pinning Neil to the ground within seconds. I slumped against the wall, watching the cycle of violence finally break. My father was led away in a separate car, his face hidden behind his hands. For the first time in my life, the weight on my chest felt like it was lifting. The following months were a blur of court dates and painful testimonies. I moved to a small town far away where nobody knew the name of my family. I started working at a community center, helping kids who felt as lost as I once did. I learned that childhood friends can be anchors, but they can also be chains. The scars on my hands remind me of where I came from, but they don't define where I'm going. I eventually wrote a letter to Kenny, apologizing for the role my family played in his ruin. Life isn't perfect, but for the first time it is truly mine to live. I burned the last of the childhood mementos that tied me to that dark past. I realized that redemption isn't a destination, but a daily choice to be better. The voices of the past have finally faded into a dull, harmless echo. I am no longer the victim of my childhood friends. I am the author of my own future.